Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to the world of Biblical Hebrew. In this lecture, I will give you a general overview of Hebrew verbs. From this session, you will gain a general understanding of Hebrew verbs and the various names used to denote them. Additionally, you will also get an idea of what we will cover in the coming weeks. Thank you all for joining, and let's begin this exciting journey in the world of Biblical Hebrew. In Hebrew, there are three main parts of speech: particles, nouns, and verbs. Particles include words like prepositions, conjunction, and adverbs. Nouns and verbs are formed by adding patterns of vowels and consonants to a Hebrew root, which usually contains just two or three consonants. In the Hebrew 1 session, we covered particles and nouns. Now, in the Hebrew 2 session, our main focus will be on Hebrew verbal system. We will explore the patterns and conjunctions, conjugations, rules for these verbs to deepen our understanding of Hebrew grammar and language structure. Hebrew verbs. Hebrew verbs are an essential part of the Hebrew language, and they play a central role in constructing sentences and conveying meaning. Like in many other languages, verbs in Hebrew indicate actions. For example, he studied, events, or state of being. She is wise. In the Hebrew Bible, there are just over 23,000 verses. In the midst of these verses are found almost 72,000 verbs. This means that, on average, there are approximately 3 verbs in each verse. Understanding Hebrew verb is crucial for expressing ideas, tenses, and moods accurately. So, first we will look at Hebrew roots and patterns. Learning the Hebrew verb is largely a matter of learning the meaning of the verbal roots and recognizing the patterns along with the verbal roots. Usually, more than one pattern is attached at the same time. A pattern is a combination of the consonants, some vowels, and some possible prefixes or suffixes. In the coming classes, or we will come to know about it more. The Hebrew word is normally constructed with the three root letters. The lexical form of the triconsonant verb is the call perfect third person masculine singular. We have already covered it in lesson 12. The root is the fundamental base for building the Hebrew verb. The three letters of the normal root are usually the three letters of the simplest form in the third person masculine singular of the perfect. Those three letters appears in all forms of the strong or regular verb forms. Roots and stems. You are about to discover that many of the nouns you have memorized as vocabulary have verbal counterparts. For example, here look at Melech. Melech meaning king. But when we change the vowels, it becomes Malek, means to reign. So these are the verbal changes or vowel changes will take place in the coming classes to various nouns you have studied. A root represents the origin or simplest form from which any number of Hebrew words are derived. Kinds of action, mood, person, gender, and number are expressed by changing the vowel pointings and by adding prefixes and suffixes. Or we could say that Hebrew verbs are formed by adding a series of fixed pattern, for example, suffixes or vowels, to a verbal root consisting of two or three consonants. Hebrew verbs can indicate person, gender, number by certain patterns of inflection. So once again, we have to keep it in our mind that a verb can indicate person, gender, and number by certain patterns of inflection. For example, person. It tells us, for example, that the subject of the verb is first person, second person, or third person. So, from a word, we can identify whether which person it is. Not only person, it also talks about a person, gender, and number. In English, a verb by itself does not have a person, gender, or number. It must be supplied by the addition of personal pronoun. In Hebrew, however, most verbs have person, gender, and number. These verbal characteristics are indicated in Hebrew verbs by certain patterns of inflection. For example, the word katav means he wrote. It is not just wrote, rather he wrote. A person comes along with it. This is the way Hebrew verbs are presented. So whenever we deal with the Hebrew verbs, keep it in our mind that we are dealing also with the person, number, and gender. When we talk about Hebrew verbs, gender, gender referring to masculine, masculine referring to masculine subject, feminine referring to feminine subjects. Also, there is a common gender, common referring to masculine or feminine subjects. With regard to Hebrew number, it deals with various numbers. It tells us whether the subject is singular or plural. A pattern also tells us the tense of the word and the nature of the verbal action. Very carefully, a pattern also tells us the tense of the verb and the nature of the verbal action. By changing its pattern, a verb can be changed from active to passive. So, if we change the pattern, we can change a verb from active to passive. Now we will look at verbal stems. The Hebrew verbs system include a set of verbal patterns that are added to the verbal root. The verbal patterns are called stems. There are 7 verbal stems, the kal stem and the 6 derived stems, nifl stem, piel stem, pual stem, hifl stem, hafal stem, and hithpile stem. The kal stem is the basic or simple verbal stem. From the kal stem, all other verbal stems are formed. For this reason, the nifl through hithpile stems are called derived stems because their forms are derived or based on the kal stem. It is important to memorize the kal stem. Verbal stems tells us 2 things about the action or meaning of verb: the type of verbal action and the voice of verbal action. In Hebrew, there are 3 basic categories of verbal action. One is simple action, second one is intensive action, a third one is causative action. Some other books may talk about factative, causative, and iterative. Now let's look at the voice. The voice of a verb indicates the relationship between the subject of a word and the action of the verb. There are also 3 basic categories of verbal voice: active, passive, and reflexive. Reflexive also called with the name middle voice. So these are the 3 voices that we can identify in a Hebrew verb pattern. Basic verbal conjugations. Hebrew verbs may be inflected in 8 different conjugations: perfect, imperfect, imperative, cohortative, gessive, infinitive construct, infinitive absolute, and participle. The term conjugation is used to describe the inflected verbal form that express particular verbal function. Let's look at one by one. Perfect. The perfect aspect denotes completed action, whether in the past, present, or future. Imperfect. The imperfect aspect denotes incomplete action, whether in the past, present, or future. Imperative. It is volitional. The imperative is used primarily to express direct commands, demanding immediate action from one being addressed. The Hebrew imperative occurs only in the second person. For example, you defend the cause of the weak. So, Hebrew imperative occurs only in the second person. Next one is infinitive construct, or it will function like verbal noun. Among its several uses, the infinitive construct can function much like an English infinitive, usually translated with the preposition to plus the word as in to study or to learn. Infinitive absolute. The Hebrew infinitive absolute has no real English counterpart. It may be used in conjunction with other verbs to emphasize or intensify the verbal action. It may also be used in the place of an imperative to express a command. Next one is participle or verbal adjective. Verbally, the participle expresses some type of verbal action such as studying or learning. Adjectively, it is used much like a Hebrew adjective. We have already studied Hebrew adjectives attributively, predicatively, and substantively. Cohortative. A cohortative is used to express a wish, request, or command. It may also be used to express purpose or result. The cohortative conjunction occurs in the first person. For example, let me first person singular. It will be something like, let me honor the Lord, or let us honor the Lord. This is the way the cohortative functions are translated in Hebrew. Next one is Jessive. The Jessive conjugation is also used to express some type of mild command or strong wish. So keep it in our mind that it is used to express some type of mild command or strong wish. Strictly speaking, it occurs only in the third person, singular and plural. For example, may the Lord, the third person, may the Lord give to me another son. Now let's look at the strong and weak verb classification. So in Hebrew word pattern, we have to also study strong verb and weak verb. Hebrew verbs are classified as either strong or weak. Strong verbs have no weak consonants. Now you may ask that what are the weak consonants? Weak verbs have at least one weak root consonant. So what are the weak consonants? The weak consonants are the guttural and resh. The consonants yod and nun are considered weak when they appear as the first consonant of the verbal root in certain conjugations. Biconsonant or geminate verbal roots, biconsonantal and geminate verbs also are considered to be weak. So Hebrew word order, let's look at word order in verbal sentence. In English, normal word order is subject, verb, object. In Hebrew, however, normal word order for a verbal sentence is verb, subject, and object. This order gives prominence to the verb rather than the subject, object, or any modifiers. As I conclude this session, we have looked at in this class Hebrew roots, Hebrew stems, and word patterns, voices, and word order. May God bless you all.